My children called my life's passion hobby clutter and told me I should give it up to be more useful. They even planned on throwing all of my artwork into the garage just to make the house look presentable for a family party. So I arranged for a surprise visitor to show up and prove that my clutter was not only famous, it was worth $100,000. Of all the days of the week, Sunday is the loudest. It's the day my children, Mark and Sarah, bring their own families over for dinner, filling my little house with the kind of noise I once cherished. Now it just feels like a different kind of silence one, where my own thoughts can't find any room. This past Sunday was no different. The smell of pot roast filled the air, a scent that used to mean comfort, but now just signaled the start of the weekly performance. Everyone was gathered around the dining table I'd inherited from my own mother, a heavy oak thing that had seen more family history than all of us combined. I'd just brought out the gravy when Sarah pointed her fork toward the living room, specifically at my quilting frame. My latest project was stretched taut across it, a swirl of deep blues and fiery oranges that reminded me of a sunset over Lake Michigan. I was proud of it. The pattern had taken me weeks to design, and the stitching was some of the finest I'd ever done. Sarah let out a little sigh, the kind that's meant to sound sympathetic but lands like a stone. She said it was a shame I spent so much time on these things. That's what she called them. Not quilts, not art. Things. She lamented how much space all my fabric and supplies took up in the spare room. She'd been hinting for months that the room would be better used as a permanent playroom for her kids when they visited, rather than what she called my clutter corner. Mark, ever the practical one, chimed in right on cue. He said if I had all this free time, maybe I could be more useful. He didn't say it with malice, just with the blunt certainty of a man who sees the world as a series of problems to be solved efficiently. He suggested I could give up the hobby and take on watching his youngest little Emily a few days a week. It would save them a fortune in daycare costs, he'd pointed out, as if I were a line item in his household budget. I just smiled and nodded, passing the mashed potatoes. It's a smile I've perfected over the years. It's a curtain I can pull down, letting their words bounce off it without reaching me. Arguing was pointless. In their world, value was measured in dollars saved and services rendered. A quilt was just a blanket, and a blanket could be bought for $20 at Walmart. The hundreds of hours of passion design and meticulous labor I poured into one were simply a waste. They couldn't see the art for the stitches. Earlier in the week, a package had arrived. It wasn't the usual Amazon box. It was a stiff, glossy mailer with an unfamiliar, elegant logo stamped in the corner, postmarked from Zurich. Inside was a heavy catalog printed on paper, so thick it felt like velvet. It was from a prestigious international art gallery. The pages were filled with stunning photographs of modern art sculptures and fiber art. On page 32, there was a small feature on an artist they were watching, someone named Aurelia. It was a name I knew well. I'd tucked the catalog away at the bottom of my sewing basket beneath scraps of calico and spools of thread before anyone could see it. It was a secret from a world they didn't know existed. After dinner, as I was washing the dishes, I heard their voices drift in from the porch. They must have thought the running water would drown them out. It was Sarah on the phone talking to our cousin about the upcoming family reunion I was supposed to host. I heard my name and I stopped, my hands still in the warm, soapy water. Sarah was complaining. She said it was going to be so much work to get the house ready that they'd have to come over early and figure out what to do with all of my hobby clutter. She said they'd probably just have to shove all of it into the garage to make the house look presentable for everyone. Mark agreed in the background, saying they needed to deal with it before people arrived. Deal with it. That's what they were going to do with my life's work, my art, the pieces of my soul I'd stitched into fabric. They were going to shove it all in the garage like old newspapers and broken lawn furniture. I stood there listening to them plan the dismantling of my joy, and something inside me, something that had been quiet and patient for years, finally began to stir. The water in the sink had gone cold. For the rest of the week, a cold quiet settled in my chest. The memory of their words on the porch, "Deal with it," hobby clutter, played over and over in my mind. Every time I sat at my quilting frame, I felt their judgment like a shadow in the room. They saw my passion as a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be hidden away. My son Mark even called on Tuesday to remind me about the reunion, suggesting I start clearing out the spare room sooner rather than later to make things easier on everyone. I just said, "I'll see what I can do," in that placid tone they mistake for agreement. They had no idea that their casual cruelty had finally woken something up in me. A quiet resolve had begun to stitch itself together piece by piece, right alongside the scraps of fabric. Saturday afternoon arrived bright and deceptively ordinary. I was in the kitchen, wiping down counters, when I saw it through the window. A car, sleek and black, and so polished it reflected the clouds purred to a stop at my curb. It was the kind of car you see in movies, not on a quiet suburban street in the Midwest. My heart gave a little flutter. I knew somehow this was it. The doorbell chimed a sound that made my son Mark, who was in the living room trying to fix a wobbly leg on a coffee table, groan with annoyance. He was convinced it was another one of those door-to-door salesmen trying to sell him solar panels. He wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and yanked the door open with a sigh, ready to deliver his standard, "Not interested." Psh, Kuh. But the man standing on my porch was no salesman. He was tall and elegant with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. His shoes were so shiny I could see the reflection of my own bewildered face in them. Mark was momentarily speechless, his gruff dismissal dying in his throat. My daughter Sarah, who had been wrangling her kids in the hallway, came to see what the holdup was. The man smiled a polite, professional expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. He asked if this was the residence of Carol Peterson. His voice was smooth and cultured, each word pronounced with a crisp precision that felt utterly foreign in my home. Mark, recovering slightly, puffed out his chest and asked who was asking. He sounded like he was guarding a fortress, not a 3-bedroom ranch house. The man simply handed Mark a business card. Mark glanced at it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He muttered the words aloud, stumbling over them. "Arthur Finch, Senior Curator, American Museum of Modern Art." Sarah peered over his shoulder, her eyes wide. The name of the museum hung in the air between them, an object of immense weight and significance that they couldn't quite grasp. Arthur Finch's gaze drifted past them into my living room and landed on the quilt. His professional smile softened into something genuine. He said he was hoping he wasn't intruding, but he was in the area and had been encouraged to stop by. He said a colleague from a gallery in Zurich had insisted he see my latest work in person. The word Zurich flew right over their heads, meaningless static. But for me, it was a clear signal, a secret handshake from a world away. It was Helena's doing. Mark, still trying to fit this man into a box he could understand, asked if he was here about some kind of donation. Sarah chimed in, guessing he must be lost, that maybe he had the wrong Carol Peterson. The idea that this important man was here for their mother for her hobby was so far outside their realm of possibility, it didn't even register. Mr. Finch's eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement. He looked directly at me then, as I stood by the kitchen doorway, and his voice was full of respect. He said no, he was quite certain he had the right house. He was here, he explained, to see the artist. He gestured with a graceful hand toward my quilting frame. He said he wanted to discuss my latest piece. Silence. It was a profound, deafening silence. The casual mockery my children had worn like a comfortable coat was gone, stripped away in an instant. They both turned to look at me, their faces a perfect picture of disbelief. Then they looked at the quilt not as a messy hobby or a waste of time, but as if they were seeing it for the very first time. The condescension in their eyes was replaced by a dawning panicked confusion. They looked at me, their mother, the quiet woman who made pot roast on Sundays, and for the first time in their lives they had absolutely no idea who I was. The silence Mr. Finch left in his wake was louder than any Sunday dinner argument. It was a thick, ringing quiet, filled with the unspoken questions hanging between my children. For a few stunned minutes after his polished black car disappeared down the street, they just stared at me, then at the quilt, then back at me. It was like watching a computer try to process a command it doesn't understand. The gears were grinding, smoke practically pouring from their ears. Then the rationalizations began. It was a slow trickle at first, then a flood as they desperately tried to rebuild the world that had just been shattered. Mark was the first to speak, shaking his head with a forced laugh. He decided the man had to be a scammer, a con artist. He said these people are sophisticated these days. They target lonely old folks, flattering them before taking them for everything they have. He praised himself for not letting the man get past the front door, as if he had single-handedly thwarted some elaborate heist. Sarah, ever the drama queen, latched onto this theory with relieved gusto. She painted a lurid picture of a crafty swindler who probably looked me up online, saw a picture of my quilts, and concocted this whole art museum story. She said the Zurich detail was a classic touch, meant to sound impressive and throw people off. They talked themselves into a state of righteous panic, not for me, but around me. Their initial shock was quickly being replaced by a more comfortable emotion, condescension. They were back on familiar ground, seeing me as a naive parent who needed protecting from the big bad world. They decided to hold an intervention. That's what they called it. The next evening, they sat me down on my own floral sofa like a child being disciplined. They had a whole script worked out. Mark did most of the talking, explaining in a patient, patronizing tone how these scams work. He told me not to feel bad that it happens to the best of us when we get older. Sarah chimed in, saying this was exactly why she worried about me all alone in this house, with my hobbies making me a prime target. They made me promise I wouldn't speak to Mr. Finch if he called again, that I would direct any and all communication through them. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, and nodded. I let a little flicker of confusion cross my face. I looked frail. I looked concerned. I played the part they had written for me perfectly. I told them they were probably right, that it all seemed too strange to be true. I thanked them for looking out for me. I promised I wouldn't do anything foolish. They left that night feeling smug and successful, confident they had reestablished order. They had put their silly, artsy mother back in her box. What they didn't know was that as soon as their taillights disappeared, I went to my little sewing desk and opened my laptop. My inbox had a new message from Arthur Finch. The subject line was simply, "A pleasure to meet you." In it, he formally requested a follow-up meeting to present an official acquisition proposal on behalf of the museum. I replied immediately, agreeing to his suggested time on Saturday afternoon. Then I forwarded the entire email chain to another address, one belonging to my lawyer, with a simple note, FYI, as planned. The next morning, while watering my petunias, I made another call. I have a separate prepaid phone I keep in my sewing basket for certain conversations, a little flip phone that my children would find laughably ancient. I dialed a number in New York. A sharp, energetic voice answered on the second ring. It was Helena, my agent for the past 15 years. I kept my voice low, speaking in the coded shorthand we'd developed. I told her the sparrow had landed and that the local birds were ruffled. She laughed a sound like clinking champagne glasses. She told me Arthur was completely enchanted and that the museum's board was already buzzing. She confirmed the offer was locked in and that the paperwork was being couriered to his hotel. I told her my own preparations were complete on my end. She said, "Break a leg, Aurelia," and I replied, "It's just stitching, Helena, just stitching." I ended the call and went back to my flowers. To anyone watching, I was just a quiet grandmother tending her garden. But a plan years in the making was finally blooming. My children thought they were protecting me from a scammer. They had no idea they were the ones about to be exposed. They were so busy underestimating me, they never once stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, I was the one setting the trap. The week leading up to Saturday was a masterclass in feigned fragility. I let my children check in on me daily. I answered their calls with a slightly shaky voice, assuring them I hadn't been contacted by the swindler again and that I understood completely why they were so worried. They lapped it up, their conversations filled with the self-congratulatory tone of dutiful children handling a difficult parent. They were so busy being protectors, they never saw the axe swinging. Saturday arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of Mr. Finch's black car pulling up to the curb precisely at 2 o'clock. This time, I had insisted my children be present. I'd told them that the man had called again despite my protests and that I was frightened. I'd asked them to be here to send him packing for good. Mark had shown up with his chest puffed out ready for a fight, while Sarah stood by ready to dial 911 on the creepy scammer. They had positioned themselves in the living room like a two-person neighborhood watch ready to defend my honor. They had no idea they were stagehands in a play where they were about to be the main tragedy. I opened the door before Mr. Finch could even ring the bell. I greeted him warmly, a stark contrast to my children's hostile glares. I invited him in and offered him a seat in the armchair directly across from the sofa, where Mark and Sarah sat coiled like springs. Mr. Finch smiled graciously, placed a slim, elegant leather portfolio on the coffee table, and nodded at my children. He said he was glad they could join, as this concerned the entire family. Mark immediately launched into his prepared speech, telling Mr. Finch in no uncertain terms that they were onto his little game and that he wasn't going to get a dime from their mother. Mr. Finch listened with the patient air of a teacher, waiting for a noisy child to settle down. When Mark finally ran out of steam, Mr. Finch simply opened the portfolio. He said he understood their concern, but that perhaps some context was in order. The pages were thick and glossy. The first one he turned to showed a photograph of a stunningly complex quilt, a tapestry of color and texture, hanging in a bright, minimalist gallery. Underneath it, a small plaque read, "Aurelia, River of Memory, Private Collection, Tokyo." He turned the page. Another quilt, this one, a geometric marvel of light and shadow, was displayed in what was clearly a museum in Paris. "Aurelia, Winter's Geometry, the Pompidou Center." He continued to turn the pages, each one revealing another of my creations in a world-renowned gallery or museum. London, Berlin, Rome. The names of the cities and institutions fell into the quiet room like hammer blows. With each page, my children's faces grew paler, their self-assured smirks melting into slack-jawed confusion. These were quilts they had never seen, pieces I had created and shipped off to Helena years ago, long before they had started their own families and their own judgments. This was a life I had lived entirely outside their view. Finally, Mr. Finch reached the last page in the portfolio. It wasn't a quilt. It was a photograph, a professionally taken headshot from a few years ago. It was me, smiling faintly, a measuring tape draped around my neck like a medal. Beneath it, a single name, Aurelia. Mr. Finch looked up from the portfolio, his gaze warm and respectful. He looked directly at me. He said that of course they were deeply honored to be in the presence of Aurelia herself. My name landed in the room and detonated. Sarah made a small gasping sound like a fish pulled from water. Mark just stared, his mouth opening and closing silently. All the air had been sucked out of their reality. Then came the final crushing blow. Mr. Finch reached into his breast pocket and produced a long, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the coffee table. He said it was the formal notarized acquisition proposal from the American Museum of Modern Art for my latest piece, the sunset-colored quilt, still sitting on its frame across the room. The offer, he stated calmly, was for $100,000. $100,000. The number echoed in the profound silence. It was a figure so immense, so incomprehensible in the context of their mother's pointless hobby, that it broke their brains. This wasn't just validation, it was a judgment, a verdict on their own ignorance. As if that wasn't enough, Mr. Finch added one last detail, his voice smooth as silk. He said the museum was thrilled, and that the acquisition, along with a career retrospective on the work of Aurelia, was slated to be announced in the upcoming Sunday edition of the New York Times Arts section. That's when I finally spoke. My voice, when it came, was not the shaky, frail thing they'd been hearing all week. It was calm. It was steady. It was a voice they had never heard before. I looked at the offer on the table, then at my children's shattered faces. I said, "Well, Arthur, I think we can accept those terms." I had taken back control. The world they knew was gone, and the one that replaced it was a world of my making. My single sentence accepting the offer fell into the superheated silence and seemed to boil the air. For a moment, my children just stared, their faces a mess of conflicting emotions. Shock was the primary color, but beneath it were shades of confusion, panic, and a dawning, horrified shame. It was the shame of fools who have just had their foolishness exposed on a grand stage. Then the chaos began. It was like a dam breaking. Sarah was the first to find her voice, and it came out as a high-pitched, desperate squeak. She was on her feet, rushing toward me, her hands fluttering as if she wanted to touch me but didn't know how. She babbled about how they never knew how proud she was, how this was just incredible, absolutely incredible. The words tumbled out frantic and insincere, a desperate attempt to repaint the past, to pretend the years of mockery and dismissal had just been one big misunderstanding. Mark was right behind her. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. The aggressive protector from 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a fawning, grasping stranger. He stammered that this was amazing. Just amazing, Mom. He said they had to be careful, that a sum like this required proper management. He actually said, his voice thick with a sudden unearned authority, that he could handle this for me. He'd talk to his financial guy, get it invested properly, make sure no one could take advantage of me. The sheer audacity of it, offering to protect me from the very success he couldn't comprehend, was breathtaking. He was trying to wrestle back control to make himself the hero of a story that had just brutally written him out of the lead role. They were a whirlwind of frantic apologies and opportunistic advice, a chaotic storm of regret, born not of love, but of a sudden brutal confrontation with a dollar sign. They were celebrating their victory, already spending the money in their heads, already basking in the reflected glory of the mother they had so thoroughly misjudged. I let them spin for a moment, a silent observer at the center of their storm. I watched them try to rewrite history in real time. Then I held up my hand. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a simple, quiet movement. But it had the force of a slammed door. They both fell silent, their frantic words dying in their throats. The room was mine again. I looked from my son's desperate face to my daughter's pleading eyes. My voice, when I spoke, was the calmest thing in the house. It was a voice stripped of all the soft, accommodating edges they were used to. It was the voice of a woman who runs a business. My business. I told them to sit down. They hesitated for a second, then obeyed, sinking back onto the sofa like puppets whose strings had been cut. I turned my attention to Arthur Finch, who had been watching this family drama unfold, with the polite, neutral expression of a seasoned diplomat. I gave him a small, apologetic smile. I told him that this was simply a family matter and that it would not interfere with our business. The word business was a carefully chosen weapon. I wanted them to hear it. I picked up the pen that Arthur had placed on the table. The paper was heavy, official. I scanned the terms, though I already knew them by heart. Helena and I had gone over them with my lawyer days ago. I signed my name, Carol Peterson, on the line. Then below it, I signed the name they had just learned, Aurelia. I slid the signed contract back across the table to Arthur. He checked the signatures, nodded with satisfaction, and placed it carefully back in his briefcase. He said the museum's finance department would wire the funds to my account within 24 hours, the account details I had already provided. He added almost as an afterthought that the press release about the acquisition was scheduled to go out to the major news outlets the following morning. He mentioned the New York Times again, and I saw Mark flinch. The public nature of this, the fact that this wasn't some private family secret, was a new layer of horror for them. With our transaction complete, Arthur stood up, shook my hand warmly, and prepared to leave. That was my children's cue to try again. Sarah started talking about having a celebratory dinner, that we all had to go out somewhere fancy to mark this incredible moment for the family. I let Arthur see himself out before I turned back to them. The mask of the gentle, accommodating mother was gone for good. I told them there would be no celebratory dinner. I told them that what had just happened was not a lottery win. It was a business transaction, the result of decades of work they had dismissed as a waste of time. I informed them that my hobby clutter, as they called it, was now a professional art studio, and it was no longer a space they were welcome to enter without an invitation. My time, which they had so generously offered to fill with babysitting, was now dedicated to my career, a career that paid for this house, for the food they ate at my table, and for the financial security they had always taken for granted. I laid out the new rules, my voice never rising, never shaking. My studio was off limits. My work was not to be touched. My time was my own. They would no longer help me by clearing out my supplies for family gatherings. The family gatherings, in fact, would be happening elsewhere from now on. Their faces crumpled. This was not the script they had imagined. Where was the tearful reconciliation? The shared joy, the mother who would graciously forgive and forget, letting them all share in her unexpected windfall. She wasn't there. In her place was a stranger, a businesswoman, an artist named Aurelia, who was drawing a boundary so clear and hard it was a wall. I told them I loved them, and I believe in some wounded part of my heart I still did. But love and respect were two different things. They had offered me neither for years. Their frantic, panicked affection now, when faced with money and fame, was worthless. It was an insult. They were left sitting on my sofa speechless as the full weight of the consequences landed on them. They hadn't just misjudged a hobby, they had disrespected a person, their own mother, and now they had to face the fact that they had no part in her victory. They had mocked the artist, and now they were barred from the exhibition. Their humiliation was a quiet, private, and utterly complete thing. And in that moment, it felt like the coldest, most satisfying kind of justice. The house was profoundly quiet after they left. It wasn't the empty quiet of loneliness I had grown used to. It was the clean, expansive silence of peace. The air itself felt different, lighter. I walked into the living room and stood before my quilt, the one that had been the silent witness to my liberation. The sunset colors seemed to glow with a gentle warmth, and for the first time in a long time, I saw it not through a filter of my family's judgment, but simply as it was a piece of my soul given form. The next day was Sunday. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down with my laptop, my heart beating a little faster than usual. I navigated to the New York Times website to the arts section. And there it was. The headline was simple: "The Hidden Hands of a Modern Master Museum Acquires Major Work by Aurelia." The article was beautifully written, detailing the museum's acquisition and delving into the history of the reclusive artist known as Aurelia, whose works had been quietly commanding respect in elite art circles for over a decade. It featured a stunning picture of my quilt, and near the bottom, it mentioned that Aurelia was the artistic name of Carol Peterson, a Midwestern artist who had long cherished her privacy. My secret was out, but it no longer felt like a secret. It felt like the truth. The family reunion scheduled for the following weekend was canceled. Sarah sent a curt group text to the extended family, citing a private family matter. But the New York Times is not a private family matter. My cousin Linda was the first to call Mark, I found out later. She had seen the article shared on social media. She wanted to know if the Carol Peterson mentioned was really her Aunt Carol. My phone started to buzz with texts, but I didn't look at them. I could feel their panicked energy even through the screen. Later, I glanced at the lock screen, a dozen messages from Mark and Sarah. They were a cascade of desperation. They started with feigned concern for my sudden exposure, then shifted to wounded accusations about why I never told them, how I had embarrassed them in front of the whole family. The final few texts were simply pleading. They asked what they were supposed to tell people. They asked how we could fix this. The "we" was the part that made me sigh. They still saw my life as a group project they were entitled to manage. I put the phone on silent and left it on the kitchen counter. The change in my neighborhood was subtle, but immediate. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who usually just gave me a polite nod as she collected her mail, stopped me by the driveway. She held a copy of our local paper, which had picked up the story. Her face was a mixture of awe and bewilderment. She said she had no idea she was living next to a famous artist all these years, and that my quilt looked beautiful in the picture. It wasn't fawning or intrusive, just a simple acknowledgement, a sign of respect. The sweet old lady was gone, replaced by someone of substance. My days took on a new rhythm, one of my own making. My spare room, once the clutter corner, was now my sanctuary, my studio. The door stayed closed. The space was filled with the quiet snip of scissors, the hum of my sewing machine, and the light pouring in from the window. I spent hours there, not in a rush, not to prove anything, but for the simple joy of creation. I was starting a new piece, a complex pattern of deep greens and silver that reminded me of a forest after a storm. I was at peace. One afternoon, as I was pinning a difficult section, my other phone rang, the flip phone. The caller ID showed an international number. I smiled and answered. It was my friend Alistair, a curator at the Tate Modern in London. His voice was a warm, familiar boom. He wasn't calling about the article, though he'd seen it, and was terribly amused by the drama he could read between the lines. He was calling to argue with me about a new, fusible batting technique he was experimenting with. We debated the merits of cotton versus wool blends for nearly an hour, two professionals talking shop. We made plans to meet for lunch the next time I was in London. As I hung up, my other phone buzzed again on the counter across the house. I could see the screen light up with another long, desperate paragraph from one of my children. I didn't move to read it. My world was no longer contained in this house or defined by their narrow expectations. My world was in London, in Zurich, in Tokyo. It was in the quiet, focused work of my own two hands. And in that world, I was finally completely free. I learned that some people can only measure value in dollars and cents. They see a quilt and see wasted time. They don't see the art until they see the price tag. They can't feel the love or the passion stitched into the fabric, but they can read a bank statement. I learned that my work's worth was never determined by their validation, but their respect certainly was. And that is what real justice looks like.